The story of Job is one of the most intense biblical episodes that depict human suffering. Job was struck by a series of calamities, leaving him devastated in various aspects. Job's suffering was physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. However, Job's suffering was part of something greater that he was not even aware of. God had allowed Satan to afflict Job to prove that he was indeed a faithful believer and fearful of the Lord. Although Job did not understand, his suffering served to perfect his faith. Job's suffering began in the financial realm. Previously, however, the biblical text states that Job was the richest man in the East. Indeed, the Bible indicates that Job had many possessions. According to the biblical writer, Job owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. With all this livestock producing, indeed, it was substantial. To manage all these possessions, the biblical text informs that Job had many servants at his service, as recorded in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 2. However, suddenly everything changed. Sabean's raiders killed Job's servants and stole the oxen and the donkeys while they were grazing. While Job was still receiving this sad news, another messenger arrived and informed him that fire fell from the sky and burned the sheep and the servants who were herding them. But Job's financial drama did not end there. While the second messenger was still speaking, a third messenger arrived and told Job that Chaldean nomads had stolen his camels and killed his other servants. Therefore, in a single day, the man who was the greatest in the East had lost all his material possessions. For a man to lose all his material possessions is certainly very painful, but to lose his family, which is his most precious asset, is certainly even more traumatic. Job had not even finished receiving the news about the loss of all his possessions when another messenger arrived to inform him that all his children were dead. According to the biblical text, Job was the father of 7 sons and 3 daughters. His family was very close, as his sons and daughters had the custom of always gathering, feasting at each other's houses. Then, on that day, while Job's children were gathered at the house of the eldest brother, a very strong wind blew and caused the house to fall upon them, killing them all. Faced with such a great calamity, Job did not revolt against God. He merely tore his clothes, shaved his head in mourning, and glorified the name of the Lord, recognizing that God was the true owner of everything he had possessed. It is interesting to note that despite all his drama and suffering, Job did not sin. However, Satan claimed that Job had not failed in his faith because he still had his health. Then, God allowed Satan to afflict Job's health. Satan was not given permission to take Job's life, but he was allowed to make him suffer from some illness. As soon as Satan struck Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Many people are curious to know what Job's illness was, but the truth is that any attempt to identify the exact disease that afflicted Job is futile. All that is known is that this disease caused him great physical suffering. He lost weight, had fever, and suffered intense pains down to his bones. Obviously, at this point, Job was also crushed by emotional suffering. He had to deal with the loss of all his possessions, the death of his servants and children, and the pessimism of his wife, his companion who had survived all that disaster. Because of all this, Job felt despair, anguish, had insomnia, lack of joy, and was encouraged by his wife to curse God and hasten his tragic end. However, Job did not yield. He rebuked his wife and pointed out that God had the full right to do whatever he wanted with them. However, Job not only faced physical and mental suffering, but also social and spiritual suffering. If Job's own wife was advising him to end the situation quickly and accept certain death, Job's friends, when they came to visit him, also began to try to find fault in Job. Essentially, they claimed that Job was suffering because he was a terrible sinner. Consequently, in a context where people interpreted Job's suffering under the logic of retribution law, Job was socially rejected and scorned. The Bible records that people gathered to mock Job. He was surrounded by mockers and had become an abomination to men. Job felt as if people were constantly spitting in his face. If Job was judged by his own wife and by his friends, who were the closest people he had left, imagine then how it must have been with other people who had no consideration for him. Obviously, all this also generated a very great spiritual drama for Job. In the long dialogues between Job and his friends, he tried to defend himself from their mistaken accusations, but he also could not find a rational explanation for his suffering. The book of Job shows that he was suffering but did not know why this was happening to him. Then, amidst this drama, Job spoke about things he had no knowledge of and should never have spoken of. His suffering was so great that he cursed the night he was conceived by his mother and the day of his birth. He wished he had been stillborn and lamented for still being alive. These were the words of a man in spiritual crisis, but who at all times never proved to have false faith. Therefore, in the end, Job heard the voice of the Lord. God did not explain to Job the reason for all his suffering, but he comforted him and taught him about the superiority of divine wisdom over human wisdom. Afterward, God put an end to Job's suffering and restored to him double all that he had previously owned. Job, then, was marked in history as one of the greatest examples of resilience and, above all, of fidelity to God. Job's patience is praised in the biblical pages, and his conduct is a model for all those who face pain and suffering. In summary, as we contemplate Job's journey through his profound adversity, we see a vivid portrayal of human suffering in its multiple dimensions. Job experienced devastating financial losses, the incomparable pain of familial loss, severe physical afflictions, and social and spiritual isolation. However, at the heart of his trial was a reality that transcends human understanding, divine sovereignty, and a man's unwavering faithfulness to God. Job, in his affliction, was unaware of the celestial dialogue that determined his ordeal. This means he suffered without knowing why, and the book of Job ends without giving him that explanation. However, his faithfulness was tested not as punishment, but as proof of his integrity and fear of the Lord. This story invites us to reflect on the nature of suffering and on the sovereignty of God, which operates in dimensions we often do not perceive or understand. In this sense, we can draw 5 valuable lessons from Job's suffering. First, we must recognize, as Job did, that God is sovereign over all life circumstances. Amid adversity, we are called to trust that He has a purpose, even when that purpose eludes us. Second, Job's story encourages us to maintain our integrity and faith, even when we face the toughest tests. True faith is one that remains steadfast, not just in moments of blessing, but also in the depths of suffering. Third, Job teaches us the importance of humility and acceptance. In the face of suffering, we are reminded of our human fragility and limitations. Accepting God's sovereignty means trusting in His wisdom and goodness, even without fully understanding His ways. Fourth, the conclusion of Job's suffering story is a powerful testament to hope and restoration. God restored Job twofold, not as a reward for his faithfulness, but as an expression of His grace and mercy. This assures us that in God there is always hope for renewal, even in the most desperate situations. Fifth, we are called to be like Job's friends in intention, but not in execution. We should approach those who suffer with compassion, but we should also listen more than we speak, and know how to offer support without judgment. In our communities, may we be a friendly and comforting presence for those facing the challenge of suffering. Thus, we should pray to God that He helps us recognize His sovereignty and His constant presence in our lives. We should ask the Lord to help us trust in Him amid trials and to maintain our faith and integrity, just as Job did. May we learn from Job to respond to suffering with faith, humility, and hope, always recognizing the superiority of God's wisdom and love. And when necessary, may we be ready to be instruments of the Lord's peace and consolation. May the story of Job's suffering inspire us to look beyond our struggles, recognizing God's hand working in our lives in ways that, perhaps, we may only fully understand in the future.